Hi, I'm David Reardon, and today I'm at the Integral Christian Center at Integral Life. And I'm really excited to be here with Leslie Hirschberger, who is one of our Integral Christian teachers extraordinaire. And we're going to talk about today this new web course that Leslie has designed in conjunction with Integral Life and Ken Wilber. It's called Coming Home, and it's all about, for those of us that are looking to use an integral perspective about our Christian practice, about how to really bring that into the 21st century. So good morning, Leslie.
Good morning, David.
When we really thought about this course and why, right? We had done the Future Christianity DVD set with Ken and with Father Keating. It was extremely popular within the integral audience. Great narrative, great context-setting story for how do we hold Christianity through an integral worldview. And then we noticed that the audience said, well, this is great, it's a fabulous story, and I love the both of them, and this is all very useful, but what actually is the practice? How do I actually do that? So then you and I connected, and you were actually already doing this. You were using the Future Christianity DVD in your women's and men's groups in Cincinnati, in the Midwest, right? And so you and I started talking about it, and here we are a year later, because it took us a while to really, with Ken, to figure out actually what were these steps, right? So, but let's start right here. Before I get into what those are, why was this important to you? I've said why it was important to us and to Ken, but why was it important to you to actually create this web course?
Well, I would probably go back a little bit. Why was it important to me to create the groups? And it was because of loneliness. And it was my own loneliness. And what I started to realize is I wasn't the only one. And I had completed the Master's in Theology. My world was cracked open by that. And I began to say, everything that I felt like I knew to be about Christianity wasn't. And I had all of these questions. And so it was really about living into the questions myself with my own practice. And this recognition that so many people were in pain. And there were a lot of women in particular in pain, because particularly within the Catholic Church, women know they're on the margins, all right? So if you feel called in any way to perhaps the priesthood or in any kind of just clerical ministry, you can't be in that. And there was all sorts of other, I don't really have to elaborate on what goes on. But there was all sorts of other woundedness within the church. And so I had a group of women ask me to come teach about the sacred feminine at their Bible study. And I went and I taught about the sacred feminine for 3 hours. And we went to lunch afterwards because they were so excited. Because they didn't know that that was within Christianity, that had never occurred to them. And this was when the Da Vinci Code was really big, so it was kind of a hot topic. But I felt like there had to be something deeper, that it couldn't be where we're just, pulling things kind of piecemeal. I felt like we had to ground it in some way in the tradition as well. And so I started the women's groups just because I felt my own loneliness. And when I finished with this Bible study, I said to the women, would you be interested in me facilitating some group? And they loved it. They said, yeah, and we did it. And what I wanted to do was to give them a little bit of what I got in theology. And except I felt like there had to be an interior practice. Because here I was getting these new notions of who Jesus is, this new understanding of Christianity, and then it's what was happening inside of me. And I was doing my own contemplative practice at home in my room, and I was reading books about it and trying it on my own because there was no containers out there. And so I thought, if I am going to deconstruct Christianity for them, and I am going to give them a whole new way of being, there has to be some way that they can access their own inner states, and that we as a community, we're creating a container. And it was an unknown. So when you say, where's it going? A lot of times we say, I don't know. So then that summer, because that course went so well, I decided to offer a few more. And I just shot it out to people that I knew. I'd been quite active in my parish community for about 30 years, from the time I was a teenager. So I'd had people knew and had some sense of trust in me, and the classes just started to fill. And that blew me away, and I thought, I'm onto something here. And so we started doing the groups together, and David, it was just this constant, feeling into what's the next piece. And the next piece always emerged from their interiors. So I would start talking about contemplative practice, and I would say Eastern traditions, and actually Eastern Christianity, has centuries-old practices. So they'd say, so Leslie, you know, before they would never have considered asking something about Buddhism, for instance. So Leslie, can we do perhaps a book on Pema Chodron or a Thich Nhat Hanh book or something like that where we can learn some Buddhist practice? And so what they started to find is when they would start doing, say, a Vipassana practice, or they would start doing a mindfulness practice, it informed how they walked into Christianity. And so then the next class would emerge out of that. So being a part of the JFK program, the integral community through the JFK program, I was thinking, okay, what would integral Christianity look like? And just started feeling into that and writing about that. And it was so much from the experience of these groups, from their interiors, because I went in to teach them about something. And as you know, as a teacher, it never works out that way because it was what they taught me. And so it was so humbling to walk in and have my assumptions tested again and again, that they had these rich interiors that they were bringing forth. So when you created the Future of Christianity video, it was so exciting because I said, okay, this is what it might look like. And started to show it to people, and they would then say, okay, let's go to somebody's house and show it again. I want to show it to my partner, my husband. Which sometimes went well and sometimes it didn't because
they
weren't walking through the practices.
Correct. They didn't go through the steps. It was sort of like, here's the story that we just land on you, and you go, some people can go, that's so helpful, and others go, that's a little confusing to me, right? Because I'm not there yet, right?
I'm not there yet, and I don't have that inner grounding. And what is this contemplation, and what is that Eastern? Is that Buddhism? So there's all of this confusion, which is why it's just so big to have your own interior practice so that you can experience it yourself. And it's always like, try this at home. And that's what we did, and it's still unfolding now.
Yeah. So one thing I noticed when we did our interview early on, when I first met you, is that your story, your personal story, which people can actually listen to, we're going to make it available so that you actually track through how you got to where you are, comes up through the Catholic Church. And certainly that, when we say the church, sometimes people mean that, and sometimes, well, there's all over there half called Protestants, right? That was me, right? I came up in the Congregational Church, right? And as I like to look back on it, even though it was it was a lovely sort of upbringing. I can remember some really nice moments at midnight services and the music and the candles and all the rest of it. But I always felt, looking back on it, that that form of Christianity was sort of like we were addressing our prayers to whom it may concern. It just didn't, there wasn't a lot of juice there for me as I was growing up. When I look back on it and say, was I really having some sort of experience that was deep and interior? Not so much, right? But then, typical of all of us, I went east, contemplative practice, started meditating, certainly considered a lot of indigenous kinds of, approaches to God and experiences that way. And then found myself in the mystery of it coming kind of back into Christianity and saying, all right, so Jesus and Mary and their relationship and all that. So I guess what I wanted to point out is that there are many, many, many different lines to this that can be both Catholic and Protestant, but the common thing between them is this notion of this practice at this level. Right now in my life, in the 21st century, where do I want to bring this forward? Because I may have rejected some of the traditional church, or I may have rejected all of it, gone away from it a while, and now come back, right? Which is really why we call this coming home, which is this lovely notion of coming back, right? So I'm just noticing that, and for all of those in the audience, is there are many roads. It didn't have to come through the Catholic Church to get here, right? So that was important for me to connect with you and to say, actually, this speaks to me, even though I didn't grow up in the Catholic Church, okay? So let's talk a little bit about when you and Ken and I talked about sort of like this thing of where do we start, right? What is the most important first thing? And you were already there. Ken certainly agreed and expanded. It's certainly something I've noticed within all of the interviews with all the Christian people that I'm doing. And that's this notion of perspective. And expanding our perspectives of what we actually hold a Christian practice to be. So can you talk a little bit about that in terms of why start there, and what does that actually mean when we say, consider this, expand your perspectives? Yeah.
Well, probably the first thing that I would want to talk about is that the location of authority for Christians has always been outside of oneself. So that is that the church tells us that this is, and when you really think about the history of the church, it was at the beginning all of these messy bands of people, and it was really codified, in the 3rd century. And so then it becomes this belief system, it becomes a doctrinal system, and that's not always a bad thing. That was necessary for the time, perhaps to some degree. But what has happened, and this has been my experience of a lot of people who come through, whatever strand they come through, is that this notion of my own experience of Christianity doesn't always come up for them. And so what about, where am I? How do I show up in this? And it's so different from you who's sitting over there, which is so different from you sitting over there. Oh, so am I supposed to believe that? And I would see this sometimes emerge in my groups, where it became, okay, we'll shift our location of authority from the Vatican to, well, Leslie, so what are you saying? And what's Ken Wilber or Father Thomas or Cynthia Bourgeot saying? And that's a piece, but it's saying, what if you considered that Spirit emerges through you as well? And that your perspective is your own unique perspective. And it's part of this vast constellation. And so what I started to think of is that we were sitting under this beautiful starlit sky, full of constellations. And what we did is the dominant story was foregrounded in the sky. And that became the one story, the one true story. And there were all of these other stars in the sky that were backgrounded. And they were us. And they were all of the people who came through. And so what about getting curious about these other stories? What about getting curious about the contemplative path? What about getting really curious about people who were gathering in community and chanting? And what would that say to us today? And so what I've really felt, in one other piece about that, I went to El Salvador for the first time, I would say, in maybe 2005. And I'm in this community in El Salvador, and these are people who have been through a traumatic war. And we're sitting in this small room, and for them, Jesus, Christos, you understand our pain. You understand war. You understand being poor and being the oppressed ones. And they talked about Christos so differently than I did in my suburban parish in the Midwest. And it's interesting because my husband is not religious, nor is my son, and you could feel they're deeply moved by this experience of these people. And so it started to just be born inside of me that there's perspectives like this all over the world, and we can't discount them. And what if we could get curious about these different stories and invite people into this notion that your perspective is bringing forth the Christ itself. In the unfolding, there's you. So it's a shift of location of authority from outside of myself to inside of myself, and inside of the communities that we're creating. That is mystery itself. Right. And those are all of the other stars in the sky. And we're still seeing more.
So this whole notion of perspectives is really going to be the first half of the course, right? The first 6 of the 12 are going to be perspectives that you and Ken sort of laid out and said, not this is the way, but here are some things for you to consider, right? And in your shaping of this vessel, you may be attracted to one or another, or you may be attracted to all of them, or you may have you're going to have a unique reading of what works for you. So some of those we've talked about this first notion of these 4 perspectives of sort of coming into relationship with this whole experience, a spiritual experience with Jesus and Christianity in particular, both interior and exterior. Then the second thing, which I'm really excited about, the piece that you are so excited about, is that you've actually taken the Trinity, which is one of the classic traditional church teachings, and you've reinterpreted it at this, in this notion of what about all four of these things, and then listen to the story again and sort of see where the Father, the Son, right, and the Holy Spirit, how that plays out.
And we might rename them in that.
Yeah, we may rename them in that, but we won't tell them that right now, right? So that's one. So then the next thing is this notion of the historical Jesus, which has certainly been in the news a lot on the History Channel and Discovery. They keep, finding tombs and saying, gee, he was actually a real guy. Well, then that totally conflicts with this. No, he was the divine Son of God. Actually, they don't conflict. There's actually ways that those interrelate, because there was, we think, some person here. We're all doing something because of something that happened. So we're going to look at that. And there's some actually quite deep scholarship around that through the Jesus seminars and things where we look at the historical Jesus. So you can kind of take that in and say, all right, there's that piece, right? Then we're going to move into this notion of broadening your circle of care, right? And I'm going to get back to that in a second, because I think that's a really important one. Then the divine, or the feminine face of the divine, right? We're actually going to now bring back, right? Whereas it may have been more male-oriented, now we're going to bring the feminine back into it and say, where's that? What does that bring us, right? And then the last one is to actually say, if we're making this claim that actually our Christian practice can actually exist in this contemporary world, that we ought to see evidence of that, right? And so we're going to look out into the contemporary world and say, well, so what are the stories being told? And the obvious ones on the negative side would be some of the scandals in the church in terms of the child abuse. And on the positive side, we would see these giant Christian communities out dealing with AIDS and hunger and all those kinds of things, right? So we're going to look at all that, right? And that's just the first half of the course. And those are really just to say, look, here are some more perspectives that you may widen, and some of this may make sense to you as you reshape whatever you want to do. So let's talk about one of those. And I'm going to go back to this broadening the circle of care, because this is such an important concept that we notice in ourselves as we say, why is it that we're rejecting the traditional church? And you go, because they don't care about all the people I care about now, right? Or they have some judgment about someone who's gay, or they have something, right? And we say, and that's not me anymore. And it's not Christian in my relationship with it. So can you talk a little bit about this broadening the circle of care
If I were going to say that one piece of everything you described was the portal of entry for a massive interior shift for me, this is the one of the broadening the circle of care. And first of all, if you're looking at the documents, the Bible, from the historical Jesus perspective, you start to recognize that the writers of the Gospels were writing from a very specific cultural milieu with very different value systems. And what started to strike me was that, okay, I found the church becoming very, they would start to recognize cultural milieu when perhaps Jesus talking about slavery, all right? And they'd say, well, that was the cultural milieu of the time, okay? But they wouldn't say that was the cultural milieu of the time when talking about homosexuality, when talking about women and power. And it was, that struck me as a bit of a blind spot.
Yes.
And so that was the first piece, okay? So that's the portal of entry, which kind of cracks that tenacious hold that the church has on it, okay? The second piece for me is that the church teaches a lot. From the altar, I learned a lot about compassion. We would put our money in for the Maryknoll sisters, money in for the poor. But the poor, or the people on the margins, or people who are different in some way are still out there, okay? We're putting it into the collection box. We're reading about them and, oh, those poor people in Haiti or something like that. So they're still not a part of our we. They're somebody else's we. And there are these different collections of we. And so for me, it was back to El Salvador. And what I look at is that Christian practice, what distinguishes Christian practice is, what is my obstacle to love? And I started to realize that I was writing about the poor and talking about the poor with groups or in something that I would write. But going to El Salvador and walking in those communities, I could feel the anxiety, just this gripping anxiety inside of me. It's a pretty dangerous culture.
Sure.
And the absolute moving, fantastic hospitality of those people moved me so deeply that they stopped becoming those people, that they became a we. that they would kill a chicken if it was their last chicken for my husband and I, and they would wait to eat.
Yes.
That they would pull up, they had no chairs, but they'd pull up a cinder block and then bring us whatever they had. And I thought, do I do that kind of hospitality in Cincinnati, Ohio? And I see hospitality as a really core piece of Christian practice. And I had always seen them as other. And I didn't know that I saw them as other until I was down there. And they invited me into their we. It wasn't that there is a gringo, what they would see as a wealthy gringo coming from the States. You are, my daughter lives in El Salvador and she works in these communities, and you were Lauda's mother. And we love Lauda, so we love you. And so it was also my daughter, and her name is Lara, that's the name they call her, but my daughter would tell me often how she felt like, why didn't you tell me this, Mom? Why didn't you tell me this was going on in the world? And I thought I did. So for her, it was an inner experience that broadening your circle of care was stepping outside of your ethnocentric perspective. And when I look at the body politic around Christianity right now, it makes me really sad, because so often it is about us, them. It is about that we are the chosen people. It is about that this community is the right practice, and not all communities, but this is what gets foregrounded, and this is what gets trickled down to young people where sometimes they don't have an interest in Christianity. And I say, how can a tradition rooted in a gospel of love have this aspect of itself foregrounded in this culture? And so sometimes it takes stepping outside of your ethnocentric view and looking another person in the eye and say, the Christ in you sees the Christ in me sees the Christ in you. And you are the Christ. And that had to be modeled to me by the Salvadorans.